All right, welcome back everybody to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something, well, kind of a big deal, the reactions and all the fallout from Trump's recent election win. And we've got a pretty interesting mix of stuff to go through for this one. We've got this opinion podcast episode that makes, well, some pretty bold predictions, and also a bunch of social media posts that really kind of capture, I guess you could say, the raw emotions of this whole unexpected outcome. You ready to jump in?
Yeah, it's definitely a wild moment in history we're in right now. There's a real clash happening, kind of clash of ideologies, and a lot of uncertainty about what's next. This mix of sources, it gives us a pretty unique perspective, like a window into how different people and groups are dealing with this election and what they think might happen because of it.
Okay, well let's kick things off with the whole economic side of things, because that's something that the podcast kept coming back to. They basically painted this picture of like widespread panic, especially among like big institutions like, central banks and the World Economic Forum. They even use the term deep state, which I don't know, that always kind of throws me off a little. But anyway, they seemed really concerned about Trump's his proposed policies, especially his stance on tariffs, taxes on imported goods.
Yeah, I can see why they'd be nervous. The way they talked about Trump's economic approach on the podcast, it definitely leans towards protectionism, shielding our industries from foreign competition. It's pretty different from the globalized free trade approach that a lot of those big institutions have been pushing for.
Yeah, and the podcast really went deep on the whole tariffs thing. They even compared it to, get this, President McKinley's time in office back in the late 1800s. Apparently, tariffs were like a big part of U.S. economic policy back then, and their argument was that tariffs worked better back then because there wasn't a central bank, like the Federal Reserve, or even a federal income tax. That's a pretty big claim, isn't it?
Oh, for sure, yeah. The podcast is basically saying that Trump might try to recreate those conditions,
Yeah.
shrinking the government, maybe even getting rid of the Federal Reserve and income tax altogether. Now, whether that would actually work in today's world, well, that's a whole other question. But it shows you just how much some people think things could change, really drastically.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. For someone like me who doesn't really get economics, what could all this actually mean? Like in everyday life, what would we see?
Well, if Trump policies actually lead to a shift away from all this globalization, we might see a comeback for domestic manufacturing, which could mean more jobs here in the U.S. But it could also mean that prices go up for consumers because those imported goods are going to get more expensive. It's hard to say for sure. There's a lot of unknowns. Things could go either way, really.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like this big experiment, and we're all just kind of watching to see what happens.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that we might not see the effects right away. It could take years for these changes to really play out.
All right, so let's move on to something else that's been a hot topic lately: energy. The podcast was really critical of the Green New Deal, and they used Germany as an example. Germany's having this big energy crisis right now, and the podcast was saying it's because they relied too much on renewable energy sources.
Yeah, their argument is that renewable energy sources, like wind and solar, they just can't handle all the demand we have on our infrastructure. They pointed to what's happening in Germany. They're having trouble producing enough energy consistently, and that's led to electricity prices going way up, and people are worried about whether the power grid can even handle it. What they're saying is that relying only on renewables, well, it might not keep the lights on reliably, especially as we need more and more energy.
Yeah, and they even brought up that Texas storm from a while back, remember, when the whole state basically froze over. It showed how vulnerable a system that's only based on renewables can be, when there's extreme weather.
Absolutely. That Texas storm was a real wake-up call. It showed that we need a diversified energy portfolio,
Yeah.
A mix of different sources, including renewables, but also some of the more traditional sources. That way we can make sure we have a stable power supply no matter what happens. It's a complicated issue, no easy answers, and it's probably going to be a big debate throughout Trump's presidency.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so this next one is something I'm personally pretty interested in. Big Pharma, the pharmaceutical industry. The podcast talked about RFK Jr. getting appointed to this important position, and his whole goal, at least what he said, is to clean up corruption. I gotta say, the idea of shaking things up in Big Pharma, it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, RFK Jr., he's been going after the pharmaceutical industry for years. He's really focused on what he calls hidden cures and the fact that these companies basically have legal immunity. He wants to get rid of that immunity so it's easier to hold them accountable for drugs that might be harmful.
And it's not just him saying this stuff. The podcast mentioned that the FDA just recently announced they're pulling some common cold and flu medications off the market because a main ingredient in them, it turned out to be totally ineffective. That seems like a pretty big sign that there are problems with the system, don't you think?
Yeah, it definitely raises some red flags. Makes you wonder about the whole regulatory system and whether it's actually protecting people. With RFK Jr. in this new position and now this FDA thing happening, it seems like things could really change. How drugs get developed, approved, all of it.
It feels like something big is about to happen, a real shift in how we approach healthcare.
Yeah, it's kind of dramatic, isn't it? The old ways are being challenged, and who knows what'll happen next. It's definitely going to be interesting to watch.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about the media's role in all this. The podcast spent a lot of time on how traditional media outlets kind of lost control of the narrative this election. They said social media and alternative platforms played a huge role in shaping public opinion, which, well, I mean, it seems pretty true.
Yeah, that's been happening for a while now. People don't trust the mainstream media as much anymore, and alternative news sources are getting more and more popular, especially the ones that have a particular political slant. The podcast even mentioned Elon Musk buying Twitter, or X as it's called now, remember, and
Yeah.
how he said legacy media was pushing a false reality during the election. It's a pretty strong accusation, but I think it resonated with a lot of people.
Yeah, it did. And then there's General Flynn. He called Elon Musk the commander-in-chief of digital soldiers, which is a pretty, I don't know, dramatic way to put it.
Definitely a bold statement.
Yeah.
But it shows how important controlling information is these days. Social media has so much power to shape what people think. And people like Elon Musk, with millions of followers, they have a huge influence.
Yeah, it's like there's these two different worlds almost, with people getting their news from totally different places.
Hmm.
Makes you wonder how we can even talk to each other when we're starting from such different, like, realities, you know?
It's a tough situation for sure. The media landscape is so fragmented these days. And this podcast we listen to, they really push this idea of two sides clashing. They even said that traditional media is trying to hide certain information and viewpoints. It got pretty intense when they started talking about Trump having a Trump card, you know, like some
Wow.
secret information he's waiting to use. It all sounds kind of, I don't know, like a spy movie or something.
Right, total cloak and dagger stuff. What do you think this Trump card could even be, assuming it even exists? Is it just hype? Or do you think there could be something to it?
They speculated it might have something to do with those declassified documents Trump mentioned on Fox and Friends. Remember that.
Hmm.
But it's all just guessing at this point.
Mm.
Maybe it's just a way to keep people interested, keep his opponents wondering.
Yeah, keep them on their toes for sure. Speaking of keeping people on edge, the podcast also talked about, well, potential conflicts, like actual resistance to Trump's agenda. They brought up Governor Newsom in California. He's calling for a special session to fight against Trump's policies. And then General Flynn, he talked about possible assassination attempts. It's pretty scary to think things could escalate to that level.
Yeah, the podcast definitely made it seem like things are really tense. And those examples, Newsom and Flynn, they show how divided the country is right now. Both sides are ready for a fight.
Doesn't seem like there's much room for compromise, does there? So what about those social media posts we gathered? Did you notice any patterns or themes? A lot of people seemed really unsure about what this all means for the future.
Definitely, there was a lot of raw emotion, both from people who support Trump and people who don't. On one side, there's this feeling of relief, like they were proven right. They feel like Trump's win means the country is finally going in the right direction.
And on the other side, I'm guessing a lot of anger and disappointment.
For sure, a lot of concern about what a Trump presidency means, especially for minorities and people who feel threatened by his policies and what he says. A lot of anxiety about the future, feeling like things are out of control.
It's like the whole country is having an identity crisis, you know? We can't even agree on basic facts anymore, let alone what we should do about them.
Is a good way to put it, yeah. And this uncertainty is even worse because the election was so close and there was so much fighting. All the accusations, legal challenges, delays with counting votes. It makes people distrust each other even more. The podcast even mentioned the vote count in Arizona for Kerry Lake's Senate race. They think something fishy might be going on there.
Yeah, they really seem to think there was some kind of cheating happening. With all these accusations flying around, it's no wonder people are stressed out.
Exactly. And the podcast even suggested that this tension could lead to actual violence. They talked about protests during the election certification process, and maybe even worse.
It's a scary thought, but looking at some of the stuff people are saying online, it's not hard to imagine.
Right. And that's why it's so important for leaders to be responsible. If politicians and people with a lot of influence don't try to calm things down and encourage people to talk to each other, things could get really bad.
Speaking of leadership, did you find that weird social media stuff from Kamala Harris and Eric Swalwell as strange as I did? The podcast made it seem like it could be some kind of secret message or power play.
Yeah, their behavior was definitely strange. Hard to say for sure what they were doing, but it shows how social media is being used as a political tool now. It's like a whole new way of showing power.
It's fascinating, but also a little creepy. Like, what does it even mean to be a leader in this digital world? How do you deal with all these power dynamics when the rules are constantly changing?
Those are great questions, and I don't think anyone has the answers yet. We're all kind of figuring it out as we go.
So, with all this uncertainty and potential for conflict, what do you think is going to happen? Is the country really on the verge of collapse? Or is that just exaggeration?
It's impossible to predict the future, especially in such a crazy political climate. But based on what we've seen from these sources, I think it's safe to say we're in for a rough ride.
Rough in what way? What should people be looking out for in the next few weeks and months?
I think it's important to watch how these ideological differences actually play out. How will Trump's policies be put into practice? And what kind of resistance will he face? Will we see more fights like the one happening in California? And what role will social media continue to play in shaping the narrative and influencing public opinion?
It's like we're all watching this political drama unfold and no one knows what's going to happen next.
Exactly. And it's not just a show. We're all part of this, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, it's like a movie, but it's actually happening. All this stuff about conspiracies and power struggles and this silent majority they keep talking about, it's kind of mind-blowing.
That silent majority idea is really powerful. It's like people feel like they haven't been listened to, that those in power have ignored them. The podcast really emphasized that, saying that Trump's win is because these people finally spoke up.
Yeah, it's like a vindication for his supporters. They feel like they were right all along, even though nobody saw it coming. But what about everyone else, the people who didn't vote for Trump? Where do they fit into all of this?
That's a good question. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of the win and forget about everyone else. Almost half the country voted for someone else, and their voices matter too. If we don't listen to them, this divide is just going to get worse.
Yeah, it's like we're two different countries trying to share the same space. How do we even begin to fix that when we can't agree on what's real anymore?
Which brings us back to that Trump card. If he really has some big secret, like the podcast said, and he decides to use it, what do you think will happen? Could it actually bring the country together, or would it just make things worse?
I honestly have no idea. It could be huge, something that changes everything. Or it could be nothing, and everyone will feel even more let down. It's like waiting for a bomb to explode, but you don't know how big it is.
And that uncertainty is part of what makes it so interesting, isn't it? We're living through history right now, and nobody knows what's going to happen next. It's like a movie, but we're all in it.
Okay, so for everyone listening, as we try to figure out what's going on, what's the most important thing to remember?
I'd say stay informed, stay involved, but don't believe everything you hear. Question the information you see. Think about different points of view. Don't let fear or anger control you.
That's good advice. And hey, we'll be back soon with another deep dive, exploring some more fascinating topics. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. This is a time for all of us to help shape the future we want,